The root of the problem in the sustainability crisis is a loss of the sacred. Through conversations with scientists, theologians, scholars, thought leaders, and friends of the Spirituality and Sustainability Global Network, Make It Sacred explores the intersectionality of spirituality and sustainability and why this intersection is critical at our existential societal tipping point. Without spiritual grounding, we won't have a commitment or political will to create hope for sustainability. Co-creation always starts with a conversation. And what are we co-creating? A spiritually grounded passion that comes from a sacred understanding of the earth. Hi, my name is Maddie, and I'll be your host as we start these conversations together. In this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with the Reverend Fletcher Harper. He's GreenFaith's executive director. He's a pioneer in the religious global environmental movement, and we speak about many things, including his recent attendance at COP26 in Glasgow. We're really excited to have you for the first one because I think even as I was researching for this interview, you're such a beautiful example of the religious environmental movement. So I'm really excited to talk to you and share this with people.
Good. Well, hope it's not disappointing.
I don't expect it to be. The first thing I want to know about you and ask you about is what your cultural upbringing and your background is like as a child.
Yeah. So I grew up in an upper middle class white family in New York City, in a wonderfully and genuinely very privileged and fortunate setting in a family that I'm very grateful for. And like many other families, that family had suffered from different challenges, from alcoholism. Both of my parents had siblings who had passed away in early childhood, a host of challenges related to that. So it was a very privileged upbringing in many ways, and also one that where there was an acquaintance with suffering and with loss as well. Now, my dad worked on Wall Street as an investment advisor. My mom was the curator of the Ancient Near Eastern department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and we were all unbelievably proud of her for that.
I bet. That's amazing.
Yeah, no, she's bright and she's going strong still. So
That's great to hear. How did that influence your interest in eco-spirituality and what you're doing now? How are those seeds planted?
I started as a child always appreciating nature and the outdoors, and in early adulthood, particularly in college, also started having was drawn to issues around social justice. And so I think the combination of those interests were what what eventually came together in the work that I do now. But where the seeds come from, I'm not sure. They were a gift, and I'm far from alone in terms of people who have a sense of inspiration and spirituality outdoors. That's actually a lot more the norm than people cotton to. But it's we know from both from research and also from countless conversations that we've had at GreenFaith that that's something that people regularly understand and experience. The outdoors as a place where they connect with what they think of as being sacred or holy or ultimately real.
And where does that spiritual part come in? Because you're a reverend too.
In very connected ways. I mean, I think God wants all of us to be as fully and lovingly and compassionately alive as we possibly can be. And I think that the beauty and wonder and awe of the natural world helps evoke our better and stronger selves in many, many cases. I also understand, and it's really important to recognize that that's an experience that is much more accessible to white people in the United States, because for many, for example, in the African American community, there's a historic memory of the fact that being out in the country could often be a place of danger. where they were exposed to violent racism. So I think it's really important to recognize that. But for me, there was a sense of spiritual rejuvenation in nature. And then I think the other spiritual moral piece of the picture is that when you see what major oil and gas companies and extractive industries and neglectful governments do to nature or allowed to be done to nature, and you see the impact that that has on people's health and well-being, particularly, it's always poor communities and socially, culturally, racially marginalized or oppressed communities that bear the worst brunt of that. That's a pretty starkly spiritual, moral reality. So again, it's the combination of those two things that, there's this incredible gift that that's been entrusted into all of our care. And the misuse of that is sinful beyond words.
When you're speaking about sort of the privilege to be able to enjoy the environment too, I grew up in the inner city in a predominantly Black community, and it was close to the beach, like 10 minutes away. And there were a lot of kids I knew that had never been to the beach just because of that gap. It's really sad, but it's really true.
Yeah, and I mean, it's another part of the legacy of racism, and it's not good.
Yeah. Well, I want to back up a little bit and talk about what you do now and your involvement in GreenFaith, because you're the executive director. And I think that whole movement is something at the SSGN that we talk about a lot and we admire it a lot. And it's a really wonderful, beautiful model for faith unity, but also, I mean, that's the small part of it, but integrating really creation care and care for the environment globally. So can you talk about your role there and what GreenFaith is?
Sure, we're an interfaith, international grassroots climate justice organization. So what we do is we work with grassroots people of different religious and spiritual backgrounds around the world to help and work and walk with them as they confront projects, the initiatives, the powers in their community that are destroying the climate, and try to stop that destruction, stopping new fossil fuel pipelines, new deforestation, industrial agriculture projects. And we work with them also to try to build the kind of world that we need, a world that's powered by 100% renewable energy that absolutely everybody has access to, a world where there are good paying green jobs to help society make the kind of just transition into a sustainable future that we know is what's absolutely necessary. So our work is at the grassroots. We stand in a lot of admiration for the courage and the energy and the commitment of the grassroots partners that we are fortunate to work with in a lot of different places. And we are, activist with and with them and alongside them. And what we see more and more is that there's a greater awareness now than there was 5 years ago or 10 years ago about the urgency of the situation. But there's a long way to go still. We're not headed in the right direction. And so we feel that our work at the grassroots and the voices that emerge from the grassroots, that those voices matter now more than ever.
And you also have people can form circles or groups in their own communities. Can you talk a little bit about that too and why that's important?
Yep, that's how our community members go to work in many cases. As an isolated individual, any of us have pretty significant limits on what we're able to accomplish and the kind of power and influence that we're able to wield. But when we come together with others, we can build more power and we can create more change. So what circles are is the local manifestation of what happens when groups of people locally who share a sense of moral and spiritual values around these issues and who are frankly fed up with seeing things going in the wrong direction get together and start to identify the issue that they want to work on in their community, often bringing a religious voice into an existing campaign framework of one kind or another. They attract other people of different faiths in their communities to join along with them. We work with them on training and skills building to help them understand how to build more influence and moral power in their communities, how to communicate effectively about what they're doing and why they're doing it. So that's that means circles are the local group, local action hub manifestation of what we do. And we've got, circles in the United States that have been part of successful fights against new gas-fired power plants. We have circles in Nigeria that are fighting against gas flaring by these massive oil and gas plants that produces huge amounts of toxic air pollution that makes people sick and destroys their respiratory health. We've got people in Uganda and Tanzania who are organizing along with folks at Circle in France, organizing to try to stop the East Africa crude oil pipeline, which the French company Total is funding and financing. So these circles are doing really, really gutsy stuff in a lot of different places. And it's pretty amazing to watch when these grassroots folks get together and start to realize that they've got some influence and that they can make a difference.
And how, if someone is listening and they want to get involved in one or even start one, how can they do that?
The best thing to do, go to our website, send us an email, send me an email, Fletcher@greenfaith.org. I'll get you connected with our organizing team. And we've got resources and training about how to get circles started. We've got campaigns that we're aware of in a number of different places that folks can get their circles connected with. So we'll get you right to work.
And you also just attended COP26 in Glasgow. Could you tell us how you felt leaving and how you felt while you were there?
I thought that the COP really had a pathetic quality to it. It fell way short. I mean, I think so that folks understand, the Paris Agreement had in it a provision whereby every 5 years, governments would come back to the table with increased ambitious climate commitments, because they recognize that the first commitments made in Paris with the Paris Agreement were a start, but weren't close to what was needed to solve the problem. So this COP in Glasgow was supposed to be the COP where countries came back with more ambitious pledges. And the reality is that most of them didn't. And that's ultimately what matters. And what we see is that not only did countries largely not make the kinds of ambitious new pledges that are needed, but they also aren't doing such a great job keeping the pledges they made 5 years ago. So that's the sort of first face of the challenge and the problem that we face. I think a second dimension is that it became really clear in Glasgow that governments more and more, as well as some financial institutions, are turning towards unproven technologies and false solutions to try to address the problem or make it look like they're addressing the problem. And that particularly was evident in the massive over-reliance on carbon capture technologies as a meaningful part of the response to the climate crisis. These are technologies supposedly that remove carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere, but these technologies have never been proven at meaningful scale. All of the experts say that they're a decade or more away from being able to be scaled commercially. And lo and behold, the biggest proponents of these technologies are often leaders from the fossil fuel industry who see them as a get out of jail free card. And so to have the COP be a venue in which those kinds of false solutions are getting put forward as if they represent a real response is just a real problem and really erodes the credibility of the entire process. So you've got, inadequate commitments, false solutions. And I think the third thing, and we've seen this over and over again, is empty promises. A bunch of financial institutions came together at the COP and created a new network of financial asset managers who appeared on the surface to be pledging to decarbonize their investment portfolios. But when you dig deeper, there are loopholes a mile wide in the text that actually don't require really substantive change by these asset managers. And yet they got lots of good media coverage, lots of good press coverage, and the commitments are far from clear. So we've got this real problem because we're behind in our response. It rises to the level of an emergency. We've seen from COVID that when the will is there, we can rise and make changes imperfectly, but we can make changes quite quickly. And what governments seem to be wanting to do is not to admit that we're facing an emergency. So I think that the COP was a real disappointment and a real spur to us to get, to work even harder to try to lift up strong grassroots voices that are appropriately, really critical of the status quo and the need that exists for really ambitious and rapid change.
Do you think that we could harness some of that collective power that people, sort of the fire and the fear that was put in people with the COVID crisis, how could that be harnessed then to transfer to the environmental movement?
So I think that what's needed, and I'll speak now very specifically about religious communities. I think what we need to see is we need to see more and more religious communities and leaders and spiritual leaders who are not talking about the climate crisis in diplomatic terms, but are talking about it as an absolute matter of urgent moral importance and really making that point relentlessly in their public work. We see too many religious leaders who seem afraid of talking about the issue with the level of forcefulness and seriousness that it requires. And that's just wrong. So I think that what's needed is more and more faith communities to drop the pretense of neutrality or the pretense of diplomacy and to say this is a crisis and we need to behave like it and we need to act like it, which means no new fossil fuel infrastructure. It means no more financing by banks and asset managers like Chase Bank, Citibank, Barclays, Wells Fargo, HSBC, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity. All of those companies need to be pressured immediately to stop financing new fossil fuel projects because they are financing as much now as they were before the Paris Agreement was signed. And that's utterly irresponsible, and it's got to stop. We need that kind of language to be much more part of our religious congregations' life and the way in which they're talking about these issues. And they also need to be talking about the fact that we need to see policies that are going to put millions of people to work retrofitting every single building in the country so that its carbon emissions are dramatically reduced, creating a new, renewable energy power grid, and putting in the charging stations that need to happen so we can move to electric vehicles as quickly as possible. And done right, that creates a lot of good jobs that helps us build back fossil free from the pandemic. And religious leaders need to be calling for that kind of response by our government and by major corporations. So I think that there's, it's a matter of urgency and it's a matter of people. It's actually at some level a matter of belief. People say that they think the climate change issue is a crisis, but they're not acting like it. And we need people to start acting like it, including religious communities.
Is this what you mean too when you talk about a green global response to COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, we've got a global, not only have millions of people lost their lives, but hundreds of millions have lost their livelihoods. And there's plenty of research out there. Bob Pollin, who's a fantastic economist at the University of Massachusetts, for example, has produced incredible research showing how governments, if they invest 2% of their government spending into green job development, carbon emission reduction, that they can create massive numbers of good paying new jobs, create a just transition for impacted workers and communities, and move society forward. The technologies, the policy prescriptions are there. What's missing is the cultural and moral and political will. And that's what religious groups need to help generate.
The first time that I ever heard creation care talked about in a church, I was probably 23, and it was in a Jewish synagogue, actually. And I remember reading that supplemental text of the Torah and just something clicking in my brain as to why this wasn't something that every religious leader talked about. Why do you think that is? Why do you think it's such a separate issue? Except for things like GreenFaith, obviously.
I think it's generational in many cases. I mean, I'm 58. People my age and older never thought about this. It was never taught, it was rarely, if ever, taught in seminary. And there was just this assumption that, religion is about individual people's relationship with God. Certainly, Protestant Christianity took that direction. I think functionally, for an awful lot of people, that's what religion and spirituality are about. And also, religion is a source of comfort rather than comfort plus challenge. And so I think that there's a generational dimension to it. What I see is when I talk to people who are, millennials of faith, for them, this is a top tier issue religiously, morally. And they, like us, don't get why it isn't for the rest of the religious community. So I think and I think that the religious communities also have made the mistake of depoliticizing this issue too much. And what I mean by that is not that there should be simplistic political partisanship within any religious community, but rather that we would develop a strong political theology about the fact that what we're up against is principalities and powers, as St. Paul writes, that are the fossil fuel industry, multinational corporations that own and control governments to a much greater degree than many people are comfortable recognizing, and that's just evil and wrong, and it's destroying the planet, and it's destroying the lives of millions of people, and that our faiths call for a different kind of social order that's based on compassion and love and justice and generosity. And that, if we think that that's naive and unattainable, then I would ask people, why do you have faith in the first place? Why can't we work to make a world like that? Why can't we demand more of our public servants? Why can't we circumscribe more the rights of corporations to destroy and take away the health of the planet and the well-being of people on such a massive scale? So I think that I think that religious groups have to get involved at that level of political theology, which is political without being partisan, and which is clear about what religion has to say about our common life.
And what you were just saying too, I think a big part of religion that you mentioned is caring for the oppressed. And a big part that people don't realize is the environmental justice portion. Could you speak more about that too?
Yep, and I would say, the language that we would use would be about empowerment.
Okay.
I think in addition to, compassion with and for and empowerment. What environmental justice, environmental racism, what it is it is the reality proven by study after study after study that where you live and the color of your skin determine the level of pollution that you're exposed to. There was a landmark study back in the 1980s by the United Church of Christ's Commission on Racial Justice that showed that if you wanted to predict where toxic waste sites were located, the best predictor was the level of, or the percentage of the population in that census tract that was of color. So race was the single biggest predictor of where toxic waste sites were going to be located. And income level was the next strongest predictor. So, and this same dynamic of communities of color and low income communities being afflicted by environmental burdens and deprived of access to clean air, clean water, clean soil, healthy food, access to open space. Those patterns play out and play through into the climate justice movement, which looks at these dynamics in relationship to climate change and sees that, again, it's communities of color and low income communities that suffer the worst impacts of climate change. What is needed is for those communities to get the support, the resources, the encouragement that they need to find their voices, to fight for their dignity, and for those of us who may not be directly members of those communities to stand in solidarity and to stand in support and to say that we don't want a society that's defined by environmental apartheid. We want a society where everybody is in this together. Everybody has the right to clean air, clean water, a stable climate, And in those communities that are most in harm's way, we're going to make a serious investment as a society in the well-being and the empowerment of those communities, those voices, and make sure that they get the resources they need in order to be safe and well and whole.
That's probably a huge strength of having the community circles, is that people can really get in their own communities because they know them and they know those things and work on a local level. Do you see that with
Yeah,
GreenFaith?
there's no question. I mean, people, yes, and it's like that old saying about all politics is local. I mean, all good campaigning and organizing has a local dimension to it also. People need to understand the local dynamics in that kind of way. I think also we see that having solidarity and connectivity between people in different regions and different countries is also important. It's very empowering for people to realize that the struggles that they're having fighting a gas pipeline in New Jersey are similar to struggles that people in Uganda are having. There may be some real cultural and socioeconomic differences, but the underlying power dynamics are similar in a lot of ways. And we find that that is very clarifying for people when they realize that, and they see that what they're up against isn't an isolated local circumstance. It's a global pattern of how power is distributed. And it gives them strength to engage locally, to have that global context and connection.
Yeah, that alone is really empowering because it gives people a sense of unity and that almost a model globally for how you can overcome those things. And do you think when you were speaking about COP26 and how the oil is sort of powering and lobbying for all of these environmental decisions, is the grassroots thing how we can start to sort of overcome that and disentangle that power from taking over the environmental movement?
Yeah, well, and I think there's a lot of really good organizing and campaigning work that is going on. There's a new initiative that we're part of, for example, called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been signed on to by 100 Nobel laureates and 900 civil society groups, and GreenFaith is helping organize religious support for it. And that's calling on governments around the world, like they got a nuclear non-proliferation treaty in place, to get a similar treaty in place on fossil fuels and to stop new fossil fuel infrastructure, to wind down existing production, and to make sure that a just transition, like we described earlier, is resourced and financed. So that's a good initiative. The fossil fuel divestment movement has had a lot of successes, religious successes among them. We're starting an initiative to pressure major asset managers, the Vanguards, the BlackRocks, the Fidelities of the world, to get out of deforestation and to get out of coal and oil and gas investments and to get into climate solutions. So I think that what's very important is and what we try to do is to raise the awareness of religious people about the fact that there are these really good campaigns and initiatives going, and to get religious groups involved in them. Religious groups on our own won't be strong enough to win the victories that are required to get us where we need to go. But when we bring our voice into that larger civil society chorus, we can make a real difference. And the religious voice is a critically important part of that social movement. So we're an important piece of the picture. And we need more and more people of faith to roll up their sleeves and jump right in, because that makes a difference.
I just want to ask you a few more questions pertaining to the sacred aspect, since that's what this podcast is about. Why do you think that having that sacred view of the earth is so important in the environmental movement?
Because it is. I mean, and something that's sacred is something that is of unsurpassable value. And that's what the planet is. There's nowhere else to live. We're not going to Mars. There's a level on which it's almost idiotic to have to defend it. But it is just a reality that this earth is an unbelievable miracle. And for us to treat it with disrespect is just unacceptable. And that's more clear now than ever. So, and that's an argument out of self-interest. That's not an argument out of profound spirituality. I mean, for crying out loud, if you can't accept that, there's really something wrong with you. I think another piece of the picture is just that we see in the indigenous communities that we work with a profound holistic understanding of what is sacred that encompasses the natural world, the human community, and the spiritual realm that we're all part of. And to me, this is not so much about saying that nature is more holy than people are, because I don't believe that. I think that the whole thing is sacred, and that we humans have a really important role to play in getting our act together to do a much better job than we have. And that I see sacredness when I see our grassroots circles struggling for what's right and being willing to put themselves on the line to stand up against very powerful, often threatening interests in their countries and in their communities. I think that that's every bit as sacred as the beauty of the planet. And I think that both are important and that this is indivisible.
It's interesting what you said. I was reading a book earlier today by the Dalai Lama, and the answer that you gave was exactly the same answer that he gave for how you get people to evoke change in their own lives. He was saying you have to let them see how sacred their lives are and their bodies are. And that's how you get them to make a change, if you start from that position.
Yep. Yeah, that's good.
And then one final question, so we leave on a good note. Could you just tell us one thing that is bringing you hope in this movement?
People working together, without question. There's nothing as good as seeing someone who's concerned go from being a bystander, someone on the sidelines, to deciding that they care enough that they want to get involved, and that it's their deepest beliefs and values that inspire them to do that. So to me, that's what gives me hope, is seeing more and more and more people saying that they're going to throw down on this work. That to me is that's what we've got. That's absolutely what we've got. And in any major social movement, that's always what we've got.
And if people want to get connected to you and to GreenFaith, would the best place to be go to greenfaith.com or .org?
Yep, greenfaith.org. We're on Facebook as GreenFaith. We're on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @GreenFaithWorld, WORLD, and that's the same on Instagram. So any of those places. And people can email me at fletcher@greenfaith.org, and I'll get you connected with the right member of our team.
Great. And I'll link all that in the description of this.
Thanks.
Well, thank you for your time. I learned so much, and it was such a pleasure to talk with you.